The emergency room at St. Mary's Hospital buzzed with its usual chaos. Nurses moved quickly between patient rooms, their rubber-soled shoes squeaking against the polished floors. The smell of antiseptic mixed with the sharp beeping of heart monitors created the familiar symphony of a busy medical facility. Sarah Chen stood at the nurse's station, her brand-new scrubs still creased from the package. At 28, she looked younger than her years, but her dark eyes held a depth that spoke of experiences far beyond the sterile hospital walls. Her black hair was pulled back in a neat ponytail, and her hands were already gloved, ready for her first official day as a registered nurse. "Chen, you're with me," called out Maria Santos, the charge nurse whose reputation for being tough but fair preceded her throughout the hospital. Maria had been working emergency medicine for 15 years and had seen every type of new graduate nurse walk through those doors. Some lasted a week, others became legends. She wondered which category Sarah would fall into. Sarah followed Maria down the corridor, passing rooms where doctors worked on patients with various ailments. A child with a broken arm sat crying while his mother held him close. An elderly woman complained about chest pains while a resident took her vital signs. A construction worker nursed a deep cut on his forearm, blood seeping through the temporary bandage. "First rule of emergency nursing," Maria said without looking back, "you see everything, but you don't let everything see you. What I mean is, you need to stay calm no matter what comes through those doors. Panic is contagious, and we can't afford that luxury here." Sarah nodded, though something in her expression suggested she already understood this concept better than most new graduates. They stopped outside room 7, where a middle-aged man lay on the gurney, his face pale and sweaty. His wife sat beside him, holding his hand and whispering reassurances. "Heart attack," Maria explained quietly. "Came in about an hour ago. We've stabilized him, but he's scared. Sometimes the fear is worse than the actual medical condition. Your job is to monitor his vitals, check his and, most importantly, keep him calm." Sarah approached the patient with confidence that surprised Maria. Many new nurses showed obvious nervousness during their first interactions, but Sarah moved with purpose. She checked the monitors, adjusted the line, and spoke to the man in a voice that was both professional and genuinely caring. "How are you feeling, Mr. Rodriguez?" she asked, noting his name from the chart. "Better, I think," he replied, his voice shaky. "Just scared, you know? I've never been in a hospital before except when my kids were born." "That's completely normal," Sarah said, checking his pulse manually despite the electronic monitor. Her touch was gentle but sure. "The doctors have taken great care of you, and your heart is responding well to the treatment. The worst part is over." Mrs. Rodriguez looked up at Sarah with grateful eyes. "Thank you for being so kind. Some of the other staff seem so busy they barely look at us." "It's a busy place," Sarah agreed, "but you're not just another case to us. You're a person, and what you're going through matters." Maria watched this interaction with growing interest. New nurses usually stuck to the medical tasks, afraid to engage too deeply with patients' emotional needs. Sarah seemed to understand instinctively that healing involved more than just medical procedures. The day continued with a steady stream of patients. Sarah handled each case with the same calm efficiency. A teenage girl came in after a car accident, her leg broken in 2 places. While the orthopedic surgeon examined the x-rays, Sarah stayed with the girl, distracting her from the pain with gentle conversation about school and her plans for summer vacation. "Are you going to be okay?" the girl asked Sarah during a moment when the pain medication was wearing off. "I'm going to be fine," Sarah replied with a small smile. "The question is, are you going to be okay?" "Yeah, I think so. It just hurts so much." "Pain is temporary," Sarah said, adjusting the girl's position to make her more comfortable. "It feels like it will last forever, but it won't. Your body is already starting to heal itself. Sometimes you just have to trust the process and focus on getting through each moment." There was something in the way Sarah spoke about pain that made the teenager stop worrying about her leg for a moment. It was as if Sarah understood something about pain that went beyond textbook medical knowledge. Later that afternoon, an elderly veteran was brought in after collapsing at a grocery store. He was conscious but disoriented, and the paramedics suspected a minor stroke. As Sarah helped transfer him from the ambulance gurney to the hospital bed, she noticed his army tattoo on his forearm. "Thank you for your service," she said quietly as she began taking his vital signs. The man's eyes focused on her face for a moment. "You're welcome, sweetheart. Were you in the service too?" Sarah paused for just a second before answering. "Yes, sir. Army." "I could tell," the old soldier said with a weak smile. "You've got that bearing. That way of moving like you know what you're doing even when everything's going to hell." Maria, who was updating charts nearby, looked up sharply at this exchange. She hadn't known Sarah was a veteran. The hospital hired many former military personnel, but they usually mentioned it during orientation or casual conversation. Sarah had been completely silent about her background. As the shift wore on, Maria noticed other small things about Sarah that set her apart from typical new graduates. When a combative patient was brought in by police, Sarah approached him without fear, speaking in a calm, authoritative voice that somehow got through to him when others couldn't. When a child came in with severe burns from a house fire, Sarah's hands never shook as she assisted with the painful cleaning procedure, even as the parents sobbed nearby. Most telling was an incident late in the evening when a young soldier was brought in after a motorcycle accident. He was conscious but clearly in severe pain, and he kept asking for his battle buddy. The psychiatric resident wanted to sedate him, thinking he was confused, but Sarah knelt beside the gurney and spoke to him in a low voice. "Your battle buddy isn't here right now, soldier, but I've got your six. You're safe. We're going to take care of you. Can you tell me your unit?" The soldier's eyes locked onto hers, and some of the panic left his face. He gave her his unit information, which she relayed to the social worker to contact his family. Throughout his treatment, whenever he became agitated, Sarah's presence seemed to calm him in a way that no amount of medication could. During their dinner break, Maria finally asked the question that had been building all day. "So, Army nurse?" Sarah took a bite of her sandwich before answering. "Combat medic, actually. Did 3 tours in Afghanistan." "That explains a lot," Maria said. "You handle trauma differently than our typical new grads. Most of them need at least a month before they can watch a procedure without looking queasy. Different kind of training, I guess. Why didn't you mention it during orientation? The hospital has a great veteran support program." Sarah was quiet for a long moment, staring at her hands. Even in the break room's fluorescent lighting, Maria could see faint scars across her knuckles. "I wanted to see if I could do this job without people thinking about my military background first. Wanted to know if I was actually a good nurse, or just someone who wasn't bothered by blood and chaos." "And what's the verdict?" "Ask me in a year." Maria smiled. "I can tell you right now, if you want. You've got good instincts, and, more importantly, you connect with patients. That's something you can't teach in nursing school." The rest of their break passed in comfortable silence. When they returned to the floor, a new case was waiting, a car accident with multiple casualties. Sarah fell into the rhythm of emergency medicine as if she'd been doing it for years, moving between patients, assessing injuries, starting IVs, and providing the kind of calm presence that helped both patients and families cope with sudden trauma. As the shift finally wound down near midnight, Maria watched Sarah complete her charting with the same meticulous attention to detail she'd shown all day. Every entry was thorough, every medication documented precisely, every patient interaction noted with genuine care. "Good first day," Maria said as they gathered their belongings. "Thank you. I know I have a lot to learn about hospital protocols. Protocols you can learn in a week. What you showed today, that's not something you can teach. You've got the heart for this work." Sarah nodded, but Maria sensed there was more to the story. As they walked toward the parking garage, she decided to push a little further. "Can I ask you something personal?" "Sure. What made you choose nursing after the military?" "Most combat medics I've known either stay in medicine within the military or go into something completely different." Sarah stopped walking for a moment, looking out at the city lights visible through the garage's open sides. In the field, you do everything you can to keep people alive long enough to get them to better medical care. You stabilize them, stop the bleeding, manage their pain, and get them evacuated. But you never get to see what happens next. You never know if they make it home, if they recover completely, if they get to see their families again. She paused, choosing her words carefully. I wanted to be part of the next chapter. I wanted to be there for the healing part, not just the surviving part. Maria understood. Many veterans struggled with leaving their service behind, feeling like they'd lost their sense of purpose. It sounded like Sarah had found a way to carry her mission forward into civilian life. Well, if today was any indication, you're going to be excellent at the healing part too. As they reached their cars, Sarah pulled off her gloves and threw them in a nearby waste bin. In the overhead lighting, Maria caught a glimpse of Sarah's hands and stopped short. Along both forearms and the backs of her hands were dozens of small scars, some clearly surgical, others that looked like they might have come from shrapnel or debris. Sarah noticed Maria's glance and quickly pulled down her sleeves. Occupational hazards, she said with a slight smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Sarah, Maria said carefully, if you ever want to talk about anything, work-related or otherwise, I'm here. I know the transition from military to civilian healthcare can be complicated. I appreciate that. Really? They said their goodbyes and drove away in different directions, but Maria found herself thinking about her new colleague as she made the familiar drive home. There was clearly more to Sarah's story, and those scars suggested her military service had involved more than routine medical care. Over the next few weeks, Sarah quickly became one of the most respected nurses in the emergency department. Patients specifically asked for her, and even the most difficult doctors appreciated her competence and unflappable demeanor. She had a gift for knowing exactly what needed to be done in any situation, often anticipating problems before they became critical. But Maria also noticed that Sarah kept to herself outside of work. She was friendly and professional with her colleagues, but she never joined them for drinks after difficult shifts or participated in the department's social events. When other nurses shared stories about their weekends or families, Sarah listened politely but rarely contributed details about her own life. The only time Sarah seemed to truly relax was when she was working with veteran patients. Word had gotten around the hospital about her military background, and doctors often specifically requested her for cases involving current or former service members. She had an ability to reach patients who were struggling with PTSD, depression, or the challenges of readjusting to civilian life after combat. One evening, Sarah was assigned to care for a young Marine who had been brought in after attempting suicide. He was stable physically but refused to speak to any of the psychiatric staff. Sarah spent her entire break sitting with him, not trying to force conversation, just being present. How many times? The Marine finally asked. 19 combat missions, Sarah replied without hesitation. Did you ever think about? Every day for the first 2 years after I got out. What changed? Sarah was quiet for a long time. I realized that surviving wasn't the same as living. And I figured out that I could use what I learned over there to help people over here. It's not the same as combat, but it's still a mission. The Marine nodded slowly. Do you think it gets easier? It gets different. The nightmares don't stop, but they change. The hypervigilance becomes useful when you're watching over patients. The training becomes a gift instead of a burden. I don't know if I can do that. You don't have to know right now. You just have to decide that you want to find out. Maria, who had been passing by the room, stopped to listen to this conversation. She was beginning to understand that Sarah's transition to nursing wasn't just a career change, it was a form of healing, both for herself and for the patients she served. As the weeks turned into months, Sarah's reputation throughout the hospital continued to grow. She was the nurse other departments requested for their most challenging cases, the one who could somehow reach patients who had given up hope. Her quiet competence and genuine compassion made her invaluable to both colleagues and patients. But Maria could also see the cost of this work on Sarah. There were days when she seemed more distant, more guarded. Sometimes Maria would catch her staring at her hands during breaks, lost in thoughts that were clearly painful. The scars on her arms were just the visible reminders of whatever experiences had shaped her during those 19 combat missions. The real test came on a busy Friday night when everything that could go wrong seemed to go wrong all at once. The hospital received casualties from a multi-car accident on the interstate, an apartment building fire, and a shooting at a local restaurant. The emergency department was overwhelmed, with every bed full and ambulances still arriving. Sarah worked for 12 straight hours without a break, moving from one critical case to another with the same calm efficiency she'd shown on her first day. But, as the night wore on, Maria noticed subtle changes in her behavior. Sarah's movements became more rigid, more controlled. She spoke less and seemed to be operating on pure instinct and training. The breaking point came when they received a young soldier who had been injured in a training accident at the local military base. His injuries were severe but not life-threatening, but he was conscious and screaming for his mother. The sound seemed to affect Sarah in a way that nothing else had. For just a moment, Sarah froze. Her hands, which had been steady through every crisis, began to shake almost imperceptibly. Maria saw her take a deep breath, close her eyes for just a second, then snap back into action. But something had shifted. As dawn finally broke and the chaos of the night began to subside, Maria found Sarah in the supply closet, sitting on a crate of medical supplies with her head in her hands. Her shoulders were shaking, but she wasn't making any sound. "Sarah?" Sarah looked up, her eyes red but determined. "I'm okay. Just needed a minute." "No, you're not okay. And that's okay." Maria sat down beside her on another crate. "You want to tell me what just happened out there?" Sarah was quiet for a long time, then began to speak in a voice so low Maria had to lean in to hear her. His voice. That soldier. When he was calling for his mother, he sounded exactly like. She stopped, unable to continue. "Like someone you couldn't save?" Sarah nodded, tears finally starting to fall. "The last mission. We lost 3 guys, and one of them, he was just a kid. 19 years old. He kept calling for his mom while we were trying to get him stabilized for evacuation. I held his hand during the helicopter ride, and he died looking right at me." Maria didn't say anything, just let Sarah continue. "That's why I have these scars. Shrapnel from the IED that got our convoy. I should have died with them, but I didn't. And sometimes I don't understand why. Survivor's guilt is real, and it's hard. But maybe you survived for a reason. Maybe it was so you could be here, doing this work, helping people like that soldier we just saved." Sarah wiped her eyes and looked at Maria with something approaching gratitude. "How do you do this job for 15 years without it destroying you?" "By remembering that every patient we save is someone's child, someone's parent, someone's whole world. And by working with people like you, who understand that this isn't just a job. It's a calling." They sat in comfortable silence for a few more minutes, then got up to face whatever the next shift would bring. As they left the supply closet, Maria realized that Sarah's first few months at the hospital had been about more than learning new skills or adapting to civilian medicine. Sarah had been trying to transform her experiences as a combat medic into something that could bring healing instead of just survival. The scars on her hands and arms were reminders of the worst moments of her military service, but they were also proof that she had survived those moments and chosen to use that survival for something meaningful. As her first year as a nurse progressed, Sarah would face many more challenges, both professional and personal. The memories of those 19 combat missions would continue to influence how she approached her work, sometimes as a source of strength and sometimes as a burden to carry. But, on that first day, when she had removed her gloves and revealed those scars to Maria's observant eyes, Sarah had unknowingly begun the next chapter of her story. A chapter where the skills learned in war zones would be transformed into tools for healing, where the instincts developed under fire would be used to save lives in a different kind of battlefield. The journey from combat medic to civilian nurse was just beginning, and there were many more layers to Sarah's story yet to be revealed. 6 months into her nursing career at St. Mary's Hospital, Sarah Chen had established herself as one of the most competent and reliable nurses in the emergency department. Her reputation had spread beyond her own floor, and doctors from other departments specifically requested her assistance for difficult cases. But, as her confidence in civilian medicine grew, the weight of her military past seemed to press more heavily on her shoulders. The change was subtle at first. Maria Santos noticed that Sarah had started arriving at work earlier than necessary, spending time in the hospital chapel before her shifts began. She never spoke about these visits, but Maria had seen her there during her own early arrivals, sitting quietly in the back pew with her hands folded in her lap, staring at the simple wooden cross above the altar. "Centering yourself?" Maria asked one morning, finding Sarah in the chapel after her own brief stop. "Something like that," Sarah replied, standing to leave with Maria. "It helps to remind myself where I am. Sometimes I wake up thinking I'm still deployed." They walked together toward the elevator, their footsteps echoing in the early morning quiet of the hospital corridors. "How often does that happen?" "Most mornings. The sounds are similar, you know? Beeping monitors sound like radio chatter. The overhead pages sound like incoming mortars if you're not fully awake yet." Maria had heard similar stories from other veteran staff members, but something in Sarah's voice suggested her experiences ran deeper than typical military service. As they entered the elevator, she decided to ask the question that had been building for months. "Sarah, what unit were you with in Afghanistan?" The elevator seemed to grow smaller as Sarah considered her answer. "Forward Surgical Team. We were embedded with Special Operations Units." Maria's understanding of military hierarchy was limited, but she knew enough to realize that forward surgical teams worked in the most dangerous areas, providing immediate medical care for soldiers engaged in the heaviest fighting. "That must have been intense." "It was necessary work." Sarah's tone indicated the conversation was over, but Maria filed away this new information. It explained a lot about Sarah's exceptional competence under pressure and her ability to make life-or-death decisions without hesitation. The day began typically enough, with the usual mix of accidents, illnesses, and emergencies that filled an urban hospital's emergency department. Sarah moved through her assignments with practiced efficiency, but Maria noticed she seemed more tense than usual, checking and rechecking her work more frequently than necessary. The tension became clear when they received word that a military transport was bringing in several soldiers injured in a training exercise at the nearby base. Sarah's entire demeanor changed when she heard the announcement. Her movements became more rigid, and she began unconsciously organizing supplies in ways that suggested muscle memory from a very different kind of medical environment. "You okay with this?" Maria asked as they prepared for the incoming casualties. "Of course. Why wouldn't I be?" But Maria could see the tightness around Sarah's eyes, the way her hands had started to shake almost imperceptibly. When the first ambulance arrived, Sarah positioned herself to receive the most critically injured patient, a young sergeant who had suffered severe burns in an equipment fire. As the paramedics transferred the patient to the hospital gurney, Sarah's training took over. She began assessing injuries, starting IVs, and calling out vital signs with a precision and speed that impressed even the experienced emergency room staff. But Maria also noticed that Sarah wasn't really seeing the hospital around her anymore. "I need saline, lots of it," Sarah called out, using terminology and procedures that were perfectly correct but delivered with an intensity that seemed out of place in the controlled environment of the hospital. "Sarah," Maria said gently, "we've got him. He's stable." Sarah looked around the room as if seeing it for the first time, then down at her hands, which were covered in the patient's blood despite her gloves. For a moment, she seemed disoriented, then quickly excused herself to wash up. Maria found her in the supply room again, sitting on the same crate where she'd broken down months earlier. This time, though, Sarah wasn't crying. She was staring at her hands with an expression that was difficult to read. "Want to talk about it?" "I thought I was past this," Sarah said without looking up. "I thought I'd figured out how to separate my military experience from this work." "Maybe they're not meant to be separated. Maybe the whole point is learning how to integrate them." Sarah finally looked at Maria. "Do you know what it was like over there?" "Really no?" Maria shook her head. She'd read about the war, seen news reports, but she recognized that her understanding was theoretical at best. We worked out of forward operating bases, sometimes just tents and portable equipment. When casualties came in, they came fast and in groups. You had minutes, sometimes seconds, to decide who might live and who was beyond help. We called it triage, but it was really playing God. Sarah paused, collecting her thoughts. The thing is, we got good at it. Really good. We could keep people alive long enough to get them to better facilities, even when their injuries should have been fatal. But we always knew we were just buying time. The real healing happened somewhere else, if it happened at all. And now you get to be part of the real healing. That's what I thought. But sometimes, when I'm working on a patient, I'm not here. I'm back in that tent, with mortars going off outside and soldiers dying faster than we could treat them. And I start making decisions like I'm still there. Maria understood now. Sarah wasn't just dealing with typical PTSD symptoms. She was struggling to reconcile two very different medical environments, each with their own protocols, pressures, and ethical frameworks. Have you talked to anyone about this? The hospital has counseling services for employees. I tried that. The counselor was very nice, but she kept wanting to talk about my feelings and my emotional responses to trauma. That's not really the problem. What is the problem? Sarah was quiet for a long time, then said, I'm afraid I'm going to save someone I should let die, or let someone die I could save, because I can't tell which world I'm operating in. This was a deeper concern than Maria had realized. In combat medicine, the calculus was different. Resources were limited, time was critical, and medical personnel had to make harsh decisions about how to allocate their efforts. In civilian medicine, the assumption was that every life could and should be saved, regardless of the cost or complexity of treatment. Sarah, in the 8 months you've been here, have you made any decisions you regret? Any cases where you think you applied the wrong standards? No, but. No buts. Your instincts are good. Your training is solid. And your compassion is obvious to everyone who works with you. Maybe the problem isn't that you're applying military standards to civilian medicine. Maybe the problem is that you're overthinking it. They were interrupted by a knock on the supply room door. Dr. Peterson, one of the senior attending physicians, stuck his head in. Sarah, I hate to interrupt, but we've got a situation in Trauma Bay 3. Multiple gunshot victim, and he's asking for you specifically. Sarah and Maria exchanged glances. Patients didn't usually know nurses by name, especially not trauma victims who were presumably meeting the staff for the first time. They hurried to Trauma Bay 3, where they found a young man on the gurney, conscious but clearly in pain from what appeared to be gunshot wounds to his shoulder and leg. As soon as he saw Sarah, his face showed obvious relief. Corpsman Chen, he said, using her military title and rank. Thank God you're here. Sarah stopped short, studying the patient's face. Recognition dawned slowly. Martinez? Yeah, it's me. Tommy Martinez, remember? You saved my life in Helmand Province. Maria watched as Sarah's entire demeanor changed. The tension and uncertainty that had plagued her all day disappeared, replaced by focused professionalism mixed with obvious affection for the young man on the gurney. What happened, Tommy? Wrong place, wrong time. Gang shooting outside a restaurant. Took one in the shoulder and one in the leg. He tried to smile. Nothing like that IED blast, right? As Sarah began assessing his injuries, Martinez turned to the room in general. This woman right here saved my life and 3 other guys when our convoy got hit. Patched us up under fire, kept us stable during the whole evacuation. If it wasn't for her, I'd be buried in Arlington instead of lying here complaining about a couple of gunshot wounds. Dr. Peterson looked at Sarah with new respect. I didn't know you'd served in a forward position. It was a long time ago, Sarah said, but her hands were steady as she worked on Martinez's wounds. The confusion and self-doubt that had troubled her earlier seemed to have evaporated. Not that long ago, Martinez said. And I never forgot. When I heard there was an army medic working in this ER, I knew it had to be you. Then meaning to stop by and say thank you properly. You don't need to thank me. I was just doing my job. Your job was keeping us alive, and you were the best at it. Everyone knew that. Corpsmen from other units used to request transfers just to work with your team. As Sarah continued treating Martinez, Maria watched the transformation in her colleague. This was the first time she'd seen Sarah interact with someone from her military past, and it was revealing aspects of her character that had only been hinted at before. Tell me about the other guys from our convoy, Sarah said as she cleaned Martinez's wounds. Johnson's doing great. Got out 2 years ago, went to college on the GI Bill, now he's an engineer. Williams stayed in, made sergeant major last year. And Rodriguez. Martinez's expression grew serious. What about Rodriguez? He didn't make it, Chen. Took his own life about 6 months after he got back. Couldn't handle being home. Sarah's hands paused for just a moment before continuing their work. I'm sorry to hear that. It wasn't your fault. You kept him alive over there, gave him the chance to come home. What happened after that? That was on the rest of us for not taking better care of him. Dr. Peterson noticed the change in Sarah's expression. I'm going to check on the other patients. Sarah, finish up here and take a few minutes after if you need them. After the doctor left, Martinez continued talking while Sarah completed his treatment. You know, I always wondered what happened to you after you got out. Heard you got hurt pretty bad on your last mission. I did okay. That's not what I heard. I heard you almost didn't make it yourself. Sarah taped the final bandage in place. But I did make it. And now I'm here. And now you're still saving lives. Makes sense, I guess. Once a lifesaver, always a lifesaver. As Martinez was transferred to a regular room for observation, he grabbed Sarah's hand. Hey, Chen. I know what it's like, coming back from all that. If you ever want to talk to someone who was there, who knows what you went through, you call me, okay? He pressed a business card into her hand. I run a support group for veterans who are having trouble adjusting. Not therapy, just guys who've been there talking to each other. You'd be welcome anytime. After Martinez was settled in his room, Sarah and Maria returned to their regular duties. But Maria could see that the encounter had affected Sarah profoundly. She seemed more confident, more settled in her own skin. During their dinner break, Sarah finally opened up about what the encounter had meant to her. I've been thinking about my military service all wrong, she said. I've been treating it like something I needed to overcome or get past in order to be a good civilian nurse. And now I think maybe it's something I need to integrate. The skills I learned, the experiences I had, the people I worked with, maybe they're not obstacles to being a good nurse. Maybe they're advantages. Maria nodded encouragingly. What changed your mind? Hearing Martinez talk about our work over there. I'd forgotten that we actually did save lives, that our work mattered. I've been so focused on the people we lost, the failures and the mistakes, that I lost sight of the successes. Sarah paused to eat a bite of her sandwich, then continued. And seeing him here, in this hospital, getting the kind of follow-up care that we could never provide in the field, it made me realize that this job isn't separate from what I did over there. It's the continuation of it. How so? In the field, our job was to keep people alive long enough to get them to the next level of care. Here, we are that next level of care. The work I'm doing now is the work I was fighting to give my patients the chance to receive. This was the most philosophical Sarah had ever been, and Maria could see that something important was shifting in how she understood her place in the world. There's something else, Sarah said. Martinez mentioned other veterans who are struggling with the transition home. I'd been thinking that maybe I could help with that. Like a support group? Maybe. Or maybe just being available when other veteran patients come through the ER. I notice things about them that other staff might miss. I can communicate with them in ways that sometimes get through when other approaches don't. Maria remembered the various veteran patients Sarah had worked with over the past months, and how consistently she'd been able to reach them. I think that's a great idea. Have you talked to administration about it? Not yet. I wanted to make sure I had my own head straight first. As they finished their break and returned to work, Maria reflected on how much Sarah had changed since that first day when she'd revealed her scars. The transition from combat medic to civilian nurse was clearly more complex than either of them had initially realized, but it seemed like Sarah was finally finding a way to make peace with both parts of her identity. The rest of their shift was busy but routine, and Sarah handled each case with renewed confidence. But the most significant moment came near the end of the night, when a young veteran was brought in after a suicide attempt. Instead of the hesitation and uncertainty that had characterized her interactions with similar cases before, Sarah approached the patient with calm authority. "I'm Sarah," she said, sitting down beside the young man's bed. "I was Army too. Were you over there?" "3 tours. Afghanistan. Did you ever think about?" "Every day for 2 years after I got out." "What made it stop?" "Finding a new mission. Realizing that the war doesn't end when you come home, it just changes form. And figuring out that the skills I learned over there could be used to fight a different kind of battle." The young veteran looked at her skeptically. "What kind of battle?" "The battle to help people heal instead of just survive. The battle to use what we learned about life and death to make life better for people." "I don't know if I can do that." "You don't have to know right now. You just have to decide that you want to try." As Maria watched this interaction, she realized that Sarah had found her way forward. The scars on her hands and arms would always be reminders of her 19 combat missions, but they were no longer symbols of trauma she needed to overcome. They were evidence of experience she could draw upon, proof that she had survived the worst and could help others do the same. The young veteran agreed to stay for psychiatric evaluation instead of insisting on leaving against medical advice. As they completed the paperwork for his admission, he looked at Sarah one more time. "Will you be here tomorrow?" "I'll be here. Maybe we can talk some more?" "I'd like that." As the shift ended and they prepared to leave, Maria felt like she'd witnessed something important. Sarah's struggle to reconcile her military past with her civilian present wasn't over, but she'd found a framework for understanding how the two could work together instead of being in conflict. "Good shift," Maria said as they walked to the parking garage. "Yeah, it was. Thanks for listening to me work through all this. Thanks for trusting me with it." They reached their cars, and Sarah pulled off her gloves as she had every day for months. But this time, when Maria caught a glimpse of the scars on her hands, they looked different somehow. Less like reminders of trauma and more like badges of honor earned in service of something larger than herself. As Sarah drove home that night, she thought about Martinez's invitation to join his support group. She also thought about the young veteran who would be waiting for her tomorrow, and about all the other veterans who might come through the emergency department in need of someone who understood what they'd been through. For the first time since leaving the military, Sarah felt like she had a clear sense of purpose that connected her past to her future. The transition from combat medic to civilian nurse was no longer about leaving one identity behind to embrace another. It was about evolving into someone who could serve both roles, drawing on the strength of her military experience to be a better healer in the civilian world. The scars on her hands told the story of 19 combat missions, but they were beginning to tell a new story as well. The story of a warrior who had learned to fight for life in a different kind of battlefield, where the weapons were compassion and skill instead of medical supplies and evacuation helicopters. 1 year after Sarah Chen first walked into St. Mary's Hospital emergency department, she had become more than just another nurse. She was the person other staff members turned to when they faced cases that seemed impossible, the professional who could remain calm when everything around her descended into chaos, and the advocate who fought fiercely for her patients' well-being. But, more importantly, Sarah had begun to understand how her military experience could serve as a foundation for healing rather than a burden to overcome. The transformation hadn't been easy or linear, but it had been profound. The change became evident during a particularly challenging week in early winter. A flu outbreak had overwhelmed the hospital's capacity, and the emergency department was operating at nearly double its normal patient load. Staff members were working 12-hour shifts with minimal breaks, and tempers were running short throughout the facility. Sarah thrived in this environment in ways that surprised even Maria Santos, who had grown accustomed to Sarah's exceptional competence. While other nurses showed obvious signs of stress and fatigue, Sarah seemed energized by the pressure. She moved through the crowded department like someone navigating familiar terrain, anticipating problems before they developed and finding solutions that others missed. "It's like she was made for this," Dr. Peterson observed to Maria during a brief moment between crises. "Some people break under pressure like this. Sarah seems to get stronger." Maria nodded, watching Sarah coordinate the care of 3 critical patients simultaneously while training a new nursing assistant. "She told me once that chaos was familiar to her. I'm starting to understand what she meant." The real test came on a Thursday evening when the hospital received notification of a mass casualty event. A factory explosion had injured dozens of workers, and every hospital in the city was preparing to receive victims. St. Mary's would be taking the most critically injured cases due to their trauma center status. As the emergency department staff began preparing for the incoming casualties, Sarah's behavior shifted in ways that Maria had never witnessed before. She began moving through the department with a sense of purpose that seemed almost military in its precision. She reorganized supply stations for maximum efficiency, coordinated with other departments to ensure patient flow would be optimized, and briefed the newer staff members on triage protocols with a clarity that impressed the senior physicians. "Chen, take charge of the triage station," Dr. Peterson ordered as the first ambulances began arriving. "I want your assessment on every patient before they're assigned to treatment areas." Sarah positioned herself at the ambulance entrance, and Maria watched in amazement as she evaluated each incoming patient with a speed and accuracy that seemed almost supernatural. Within seconds of seeing each casualty, Sarah was able to determine the severity of their injuries, the urgency of their medical needs, and the appropriate level of intervention required. Red tag, Trauma Bay 1, possible internal bleeding, she called out for a construction worker with abdominal injuries. Yellow tag, Treatment Room 4, broken ribs but stable vitals, for a supervisor with chest trauma. Green tag, Treatment Room 7, lacerations and possible concussion, for a younger worker who was conscious and talking. The efficiency of her triage decisions allowed the hospital to provide the right level of care to each patient without wasting time or resources on less critical cases. But what impressed Maria most was how Sarah managed to make these rapid medical assessments while still treating each patient as a human being rather than just another case. "Sir, we're going to take excellent care of you," she told each patient as they arrived. "The doctors here are the best in the city, and you're in good hands." Even in the midst of the chaos, Sarah took time to reassure frightened family members and provide updates to the patients who were waiting for treatment. Her ability to remain compassionate while operating at maximum efficiency was something Maria had rarely seen in her 15 years of emergency nursing. The most challenging case arrived near the end of the evening. A young factory worker, barely out of high school, had been trapped under heavy machinery during the explosion. His injuries were severe, multiple fractures, internal bleeding, and what appeared to be significant head trauma. The paramedics had managed to stabilize him during transport, but his condition was deteriorating rapidly. As they transferred him to the trauma bay, the young man began calling out for his mother in a voice filled with pain and confusion. Sarah positioned herself where he could see her face and began speaking to him in the same calm, authoritative voice that Maria had heard her use with veteran patients. "What's your name, son?" "Kevin. Kevin Morrison." "Where's my mom? Is she okay?" "Kevin, your mom is fine, and she's on her way here. My name is Sarah, and I'm going to stay right here with you while the doctors work on your injuries." "Can you tell me how old you are?" 18. Just turned 18 last month. Sarah glanced at the monitors showing Kevin's vital signs, noting that his blood pressure was dropping and his heart rate was becoming irregular. The medical team was working frantically to address his internal injuries, but Sarah could see in their expressions that the situation was critical. "Kevin, I need you to stay with me, okay? Keep talking to me. Tell me about your plans after you graduate from high school." "I was going to community college. Wanted to study engineering, maybe work in construction." His voice was getting weaker, but Sarah's presence seemed to keep him focused. "That sounds like a great plan. What kind of engineering? As Kevin continued talking, Sarah monitored his condition while providing the kind of emotional support that could be as important as medical intervention in cases like this. She had seen enough trauma to recognize when someone was fighting for their life, and she understood that sometimes the will to live could make the difference between survival and death. "Sarah," Dr. Peterson called quietly, "I need to speak with you privately." Sarah looked down at Kevin, who was still conscious but clearly struggling. "I'll be right back, Kevin. Don't go anywhere." "I'm not going anywhere," he replied with a weak smile. Dr. Peterson pulled Sarah aside and spoke in a low voice. "His injuries are extensive. We've managed to control the internal bleeding, but there's significant damage to his liver and spleen. He's going to need emergency surgery, and even then. What are his chances? Honestly? Maybe 50-50. And that's if everything goes perfectly in the operating room." Sarah looked back at Kevin, who was still conscious but obviously in pain despite the medication they'd given him. "What do you need from me?" "Keep him stable and calm while we prep him for surgery. Sometimes the psychological support can make as much difference as the medical intervention." Sarah returned to Kevin's side and continued talking with him about his plans for the future, his family, and his dreams of becoming an engineer. As they prepared him for surgery, she held his hand and made him a promise. "Kevin, I'm going to be here when you get out of surgery. No matter how long it takes, I'll be here. Promise?" "I promise." The surgery lasted 6 hours. Sarah's shift had officially ended 3 hours earlier, but she remained at the hospital, checking on other patients from the factory explosion and waiting for news about Kevin. Maria stayed with her, understanding that this case had become personal in ways that went beyond professional responsibility. "Why this one?" Maria asked as they sat in the family waiting area, drinking coffee from the vending machine. "He's the same age as some of the soldiers I treated in Afghanistan," Sarah replied. "Barely out of high school, whole life ahead of him, ended up in the wrong place at the wrong time." "Did you lose soldiers that young?" "Too many. Sometimes I could save them, sometimes I couldn't. The difference was usually luck more than skill." Maria understood. Sarah wasn't just waiting for news about a patient, she was confronting the randomness of life and death that had shaped her military experience. When Dr. Peterson finally emerged from the operating room, his expression was cautiously optimistic. "He made it through surgery. The next 24 hours will be critical, but his vital signs are stable." Sarah let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. "Can I see him?" "He's in intensive care, but I'll clear you to visit for a few minutes." Kevin was unconscious when Sarah entered his ICU room, connected to various monitors and machines that were keeping track of every aspect of his recovery. His mother was sitting beside the bed, holding his hand and crying quietly. "Are you Sarah?" the woman asked, looking up as Sarah entered. "Yes, ma'am. Kevin kept asking for you before they put him under anesthesia. He said you promised to be here when he woke up." "And I will be." Mrs. Morrison stood up and hugged Sarah with a fierceness that caught her off guard. "Thank you for taking care of my boy. The doctors said you stayed with him the whole time before surgery. He's a good kid. He's going to be okay." As Sarah left the ICU, she realized that something important had shifted in how she understood her work. Kevin's case had reminded her of why she'd become a nurse in the first place, not just to treat injuries and illnesses, but to be present with people during their most vulnerable moments. The next several weeks brought a steady stream of challenging cases, but Sarah approached each one with renewed confidence. She had begun leading training sessions for other nurses on trauma care, sharing techniques she'd learned in military medicine that could be adapted to civilian practice. Her reputation within the hospital continued to grow, and she was officially promoted to senior emergency nurse. More importantly, Sarah had begun working with Martinez's veteran support group, providing medical perspective on the challenges that former service members faced in transitioning to civilian life. She discovered that many veterans struggled with finding purpose and meaning after leaving the military, and she was uniquely positioned to help them understand how their military experience could be an asset rather than a liability. The skills you learned in the military don't become useless when you take off the uniform, she told the group during one of their weekly meetings. They just need to be applied in different ways. One group member, a former Marine named Johnson, challenged her perspective. Easy for you to say. You found a way to keep doing medical work. What about those of us who were infantry or artillery? How do we use those skills in civilian life? Sarah thought about this question for several days before responding. When the group met the following week, she had an answer that surprised everyone, including herself. The core skills you learned weren't really about weapons or tactics, she said. They were about leadership, problem-solving under pressure, working as part of a team, and maintaining composure in dangerous situations. Every job in the civilian world needs those skills. But, how do you translate them? By understanding that civilian life has its own kinds of emergencies and crises. A parent dealing with a child's serious illness needs the same kind of calm leadership you provided to your squad. A small business owner facing financial problems needs the same kind of problem-solving skills you use to navigate complex tactical situations. The conversation that followed was the most engaged Maria had seen the group become. Veterans began sharing stories of how they'd successfully applied military skills in civilian contexts, and, more importantly, they began helping each other identify opportunities to do so. Sarah's involvement with the group also helped her process her own experiences in new ways. For the first time, she began talking openly about specific incidents from her deployment, not as sources of trauma but as examples of effective teamwork and successful outcomes under pressure. Tell us about your most challenging case, Martinez asked during one session. Sarah was quiet for a long time before responding. We were providing medical support for a unit that was attempting to rescue hostages from a compound. The mission went badly, and we ended up with 8 casualties coming in simultaneously, all with life-threatening injuries. She paused, remembering details she hadn't shared with anyone. We had 3 medics and a surgeon, working out of a tent with limited equipment. Normal triage protocols would have meant writing off 2 or 3 of the most severely injured soldiers. What did you do? We refused to accept those protocols. We developed a new approach on the spot, using every bit of training and experience we had. We worked for 14 straight hours, and we saved all 8. How? By working as a team, trusting each other completely, and refusing to give up. And, by understanding that sometimes the standard procedures aren't enough, sometimes you have to innovate under pressure. Johnson nodded slowly. That's exactly the kind of problem solving I wish I could find a way to use in civilian life. You can, Sarah replied. You just have to recognize that the problems are different, but the skills are the same. As winter turned to spring, Sarah's confidence in her dual identity as both veteran and nurse continued to grow. She had been selected to lead a hospital-wide committee on veteran patient care, developing protocols that would better serve the unique needs of former service members who came through the hospital. The committee's work led to changes throughout the hospital, staff training on military culture and veteran-specific health issues, partnerships with veteran service organizations, and the development of a formal support program for employees who were also veterans. But the most significant change was in Sarah herself. The scars on her hands and arms, which had once been sources of shame and painful memories, had become symbols of expertise and experience that she drew upon daily in her work. Kevin Morrison's recovery became a symbol of this transformation. He spent 3 weeks in the hospital, and Sarah visited him regularly during his stay. As he healed, their conversations shifted from immediate medical concerns to his plans for the future. I still want to study engineering, he told her during one of their talks. But I think I might want to focus on safety engineering now. Help design systems that prevent accidents like the one that almost killed me. That sounds like a great way to use your experience for something positive. Is that what you did? Used your experience from the war to become a better nurse? Sarah considered this question carefully. I think what I learned was that experience doesn't have to define you, but it can inform you. What happened to you in that factory doesn't have to be a tragedy that derailed your life. It can be an experience that gives you unique insight into something important. How do I make that happen? By deciding that your survival means something. by choosing to use what you've learned to help other people. When Kevin was finally discharged from the hospital, he hugged Sarah goodbye and made her a promise. When I finish my engineering degree, I'm going to design safety systems that protect factory workers. And I'm going to make sure everyone knows that the inspiration came from a nurse who refused to let me give up. As Sarah watched Kevin leave the hospital with his mother, walking slowly but steadily toward his car, she realized that her own transformation was complete. She was no longer a combat medic trying to become a civilian nurse, or a veteran struggling to find her place in peacetime. She was Sarah Chen, a professional who had learned to save lives in two very different contexts, who understood that healing was possible even after the worst trauma, and who knew that experience gained through suffering could become wisdom that serves others. The scars on her hands told the story of 19 combat missions, but they also told the story of countless patients whose lives had been saved by the skills and insights she had gained through those experiences. They were no longer reminders of trauma she needed to overcome, they were evidence of a journey that had prepared her for exactly the work she was meant to do. That evening, as Sarah removed her gloves at the end of her shift, she looked at her hands with a sense of pride rather than regret. Tomorrow would bring new patients, new challenges, and new opportunities to use her unique combination of military experience and civilian medical training to make a difference in people's lives. The transition from combat medic to civilian nurse was finally complete, but the larger mission of serving others continued. And Sarah Chen had never been more ready for whatever came next. 3 years after Sarah Chen first walked into St. Mary's Hospital as a nervous new graduate nurse, she stood before a room full of medical students and residents, sharing her expertise on trauma care and veteran health issues. The transformation was complete. She had evolved from a combat medic struggling to find her place in civilian medicine into a respected healthcare leader whose unique background had become her greatest professional asset. The presentation she was giving focused on the intersection of military medicine and civilian healthcare, drawing on both her combat experience and her extensive work with veteran patients. As she spoke, Sarah occasionally gestured with her hands, and the scars that had once been sources of shame were now visible reminders of the authentic experience that gave weight to her words. The fundamental difference between military and civilian medicine, she explained to the attentive audience, isn't the techniques or the equipment. It's the context. In combat medicine, you're working under fire with limited resources and unlimited urgency. In civilian medicine, you have better equipment and more time, but you also have different responsibilities. A young resident raised her hand. What kind of different responsibilities? In the field, my job was to keep people alive long enough to get them to the next level of care. Here, I am that next level of care. The soldier I stabilized under fire in Afghanistan might end up being the veteran I treat for PTSD in the emergency room. The circle is complete. The presentation concluded with enthusiastic applause, and several attendees approached Sarah afterward with questions about veteran healthcare and military medicine applications. As she packed up her materials, Dr. Peterson joined her at the front of the room. "Excellent presentation, as always," he said. "I have some news you might be interested in." Sarah looked up from her laptop case. "Good news, I hope?" "The best kind. The hospital board has approved your proposal for the Veterans Health Initiative. You'll be the director of the new program, with a budget and staff to develop comprehensive services for veteran patients and employees." For a moment, Sarah was speechless. The Veterans Health Initiative had been her idea, developed over months of careful planning and research. The program would provide specialized care for veterans, training for hospital staff on military culture and veteran-specific health issues, and support services for employees who were also veterans. "When do we start?" "Next month. You'll have 2 full-time nurses, a social worker, and a psychologist on your team, plus consultants as needed." As Dr. Peterson left to attend to other hospital business, Sarah remained in the empty conference room, reflecting on how dramatically her life had changed. 3 years ago, she had been a newly discharged veteran struggling to find purpose and meaning in civilian life. Now she was about to lead a program that could improve healthcare for thousands of veterans. The journey hadn't been easy. There had been setbacks, moments of doubt, and times when the weight of her military experiences had seemed too heavy to bear. But each challenge had ultimately strengthened her resolve and deepened her understanding of how her past could serve her future. The real validation of her growth came later that week, when she received an unexpected visitor in the emergency department. Maria Santos approached her during a brief lull between patients, looking unusually serious. "Sarah, there's someone here to see you. She says she's your former commanding officer." Sarah looked up, puzzled. She hadn't maintained contact with many people from her military service, and she couldn't imagine why someone from her past would show up unannounced at her workplace. The woman waiting in the hospital's family conference room was unmistakably military, even in civilian clothes. Colonel Patricia Williams stood as Sarah entered, and her bearing and demeanor immediately transported Sarah back to her deployment days. "Corpsman Chen," Colonel Williams said with a slight smile. "Or should I say Nurse Chen now? Ma'am. This is unexpected. What brings you to St. Mary's?" "You do, actually. I'm here on official business, but I also wanted to see how you were doing." They sat down across from each other at the small conference table, and Sarah noticed that Colonel Williams looked older than she remembered, with gray streaking her hair and lines around her eyes that spoke of continued service in difficult circumstances. "I'll get straight to the point," Colonel Williams said. "The Army is developing a new program to help medics transition to civilian healthcare careers. We need someone to consult on curriculum development and serve as a liaison with civilian medical facilities." "And you thought of me?" "I thought of the best combat medic I ever served with, who apparently has become an exceptional civilian nurse and is now developing programs to help other veterans." Sarah was quiet for a moment, processing this unexpected opportunity. What would the position involve? Part-time consulting work, developing training materials, and serving as a bridge between military medical training and civilian healthcare practice. "You'd keep your current position here but work with us to help other medics make the transition you've made." "Why is the Army interested in this now?" Colonel Williams leaned back in her chair. "Because we're losing too many good medics to suicide, addiction, and unemployment after they leave the service. The transition to civilian life is harder than we've wanted to admit, and we need people who've successfully made that transition to help others." "And you think I've successfully made that transition?" "I know you have. I've done my research, Chen. I know about your work here, your reputation in the hospital, and the programs you're developing. I also know about your work with veteran support groups and your advocacy for veteran healthcare issues." Sarah found herself thinking about all the veterans she'd encountered over the past 3 years, both as patients and through Martinez's support group. Many had struggled with the same identity crisis she had faced: how to translate military skills and experience into meaningful civilian careers. What would success look like for this program? Fewer veteran suicides. More successful transitions to civilian healthcare careers. Better integration of military medical experience with civilian practice. Colonel Williams paused. "And more medics like you, who figure out how to use their military experience as a foundation rather than an obstacle." The offer was tempting, but Sarah had learned to think carefully before making major commitments. "Can I have some time to consider this?" "Of course. But I hope you'll say yes. The military trained you to save lives under the worst possible circumstances. Now we need you to help save the lives of the people who served alongside you." After Colonel Williams left, Sarah found herself walking through the hospital corridors, thinking about the conversation and what it might mean for her future. She ended up in the chapel where she had spent so many early mornings during her first year, trying to center herself and make sense of her dual identity. Maria found her there an hour later, sitting in the same back pew where she had spent so many contemplative moments. "Want to talk about whatever your former commanding officer wanted?" Sarah smiled. "How did you know I'd be here?" "Lucky guess. Plus, this is where you come when you need to think through big decisions." Sarah explained the Army's offer and her mixed feelings about potentially returning to any kind of military role, even as a consultant. "What's holding you back?" Maria asked. "I'm not sure. Maybe I'm afraid of going backward instead of forward. Or maybe you're afraid of discovering that you've moved further forward than you realized." Maria's observation was insightful, as usual. Sarah had spent so much time focusing on her struggle to integrate her military and civilian identities that she hadn't fully recognized how completely she had accomplished that integration. Think about it this way, Maria continued. 3 years ago, you were a veteran trying to figure out how to be a nurse. Now you're a nurse who happens to be a veteran. That's not a small distinction. What do you mean? I mean that your military experience used to define you, and you were trying to escape that definition. Now your military experience informs your work, but it doesn't limit it. You've become exactly the kind of professional the Army is looking for, someone who can help other veterans make the same transition. That evening, Sarah called Martinez to discuss the opportunity. His support group had become one of the most successful veteran transition programs in the city, and his perspective on veteran issues had become invaluable to her. Sounds like an amazing opportunity, Martinez said after she explained the situation. What's making you hesitate? I guess I'm worried about getting pulled back into military culture in ways that might not be healthy. Sarah, you've been working with veteran patients and support groups for years. You're already bridging military and civilian culture every day. This feels different, though. More official. Martinez was quiet for a moment before responding. Can I tell you something? When I first got out of the Army, I was angry about everything I'd been through. Angry about the friends we lost, angry about the injuries, angry about how hard it was to adjust to civilian life. What changed? You did. Watching you figure out how to use your military experience to help people in civilian life showed me that it was possible to transform that anger into something positive. If you take this consulting job, you'll be doing for hundreds of medics what you did for me. The next day, Sarah called Colonel Williams and accepted the position. The work would be challenging, requiring her to travel occasionally and spend significant time developing training materials, but it felt like a natural extension of the work she was already doing. 6 months later, Sarah found herself standing in front of another group of students, but this time the audience was made up of military medics preparing to transition to civilian healthcare careers. The training program she had helped develop was being piloted at 3 military bases, and the early results were promising. The most important thing to understand, she told the group of soon-to-be former medics, is that you're not starting over. You're building on a foundation of experience and skills that most civilian healthcare workers will never have. A young medic raised his hand. But, how do we explain the military experience to civilian employers? Some of them seem uncomfortable with it. By helping them understand that what you learned in the military isn't just about combat medicine. It's about performing under pressure, working as part of a team, making life or death decisions quickly and accurately, and maintaining composure during emergencies. Sarah paused, looking around the room at the earnest faces of the medics who reminded her so much of herself 3 years earlier. Every skill you learned in the military has civilian applications. Your job is to help potential employers understand those applications, not to apologize for your military experience. Another medic asked, what if we have PTSD or other mental health issues? Won't that hurt our chances in civilian healthcare? Only if you let it define you instead of inform you, Sarah replied. I've worked with hundreds of veteran patients over the past 3 years, and the nurses and doctors who understand them best are the ones who've been there themselves. She rolled up her sleeves, revealing the scars on her forearms that were now familiar to everyone who worked with her. These scars tell the story of my last combat mission, when an IED destroyed our convoy and killed 3 of my friends. For years, I saw them as reminders of trauma and failure. Now I see them as evidence that I survived something terrible and chose to use that survival to help other people. The room was completely quiet, and Sarah could see that her words were resonating with the medics who were facing their own fears about transitioning to civilian life. Your experiences in the military, including the difficult ones, don't disqualify you from civilian healthcare careers. They prepare you for them in ways that no civilian training ever could. After the presentation, several medics approached Sarah with specific questions about nursing school, civilian medical training, and the challenges of adjusting to non-military work environments. She spent 2 hours talking with them individually, sharing contact information and promising to serve as a resource as they began their transitions. As she drove back to the hospital that evening, Sarah reflected on how completely her perspective had changed. The work she was doing now felt like the culmination of everything she had experienced, both in the military and in civilian healthcare. The Veterans Health Initiative at St. Mary's was exceeding all expectations, with veteran patient satisfaction scores significantly higher than the hospital average and employee retention among veteran staff members at nearly 100%. Sarah's team had developed protocols that were being adopted by hospitals throughout the region. More importantly, the individual success stories kept coming. Veterans like Kevin Morrison, who had completed his engineering degree and was now working on safety systems for industrial facilities. Veterans like the young Marine who had attempted suicide during Sarah's first year, who was now successfully employed and engaged to be married. Each success story reinforced Sarah's understanding that her own difficult transition had been preparation for helping others navigate similar challenges. The scars on her hands had become symbols not of trauma, but of transformation. On the evening before the third anniversary of her first day at St. Mary's Hospital, Sarah stood in the emergency department during a brief quiet moment and looked around at the familiar chaos of civilian medicine. Nurses moved efficiently between patients, doctors consulted on difficult cases, and families waited anxiously for news about their loved ones. She pulled off her gloves and looked at her hands, as she had countless times over the past 3 years. The scars were still there, permanent reminders of 19 combat missions and the experiences that had shaped her. But they no longer represented trauma she needed to overcome. They represented a journey that had led her to exactly where she needed to be, serving as a bridge between military and civilian medicine, helping veterans transition successfully to civilian healthcare careers, and using her unique combination of experiences to save lives in a different kind of battlefield. Maria approached with a new patient assignment, and Sarah pulled on fresh gloves, ready for whatever the night might bring. The transformation from combat medic to civilian nurse was complete, but the larger mission of serving others continued. As she walked toward her next patient, Sarah Chun understood that the scars on her hands would always tell the story of 19 combat missions. But they would also tell the story of countless civilians and veterans whose lives had been saved or improved by the skills and insights she had gained through those experiences. The new nurse had become exactly what the world needed, a healer who understood both the wounds of war and the possibilities of peace, someone who could use the worst experiences of her life to create the best outcomes for others. The circle was complete, but the mission continued. And Sarah had never been more ready for whatever came next.